Hello, and welcome to the Health Data Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Jenny Owens, and for this episode, I thought we'd do something a little different and a little fun. I thought that I might walk you through one of my recent personal experiments in the world of artificial intelligence. I decided recently that I was going to try out creating a custom GPT to manage some of the content that I use for generating this podcast. So I have a bunch of papers that I have in a to be read pile, essentially saying, hey, you might want to reference this, you might want to think about this particular concept in the future. And then of course I have a long podcast archive full of papers and books and other podcasts and interviews that I have covered already. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be neat if I could take my reference manager like I used to use back in the good old days of graduate school, where I used to throw every paper that I was reading into that, and then I had it there ready for me for my next grant writing or, my next talk that I was doing. Wouldn't it be nice if I could do something very similar with this podcast? So for anybody from the Cleveland Clinic who is watching, I want to be clear, this is entirely personal stuff. There is no Cleveland Clinic IP going into this. This is just papers that I'm pulling off of JAMA or out of Nature, transcripts of podcasts that I've previously recorded. No data, nothing like that. But I thought this is nifty. And I've heard a lot of people discuss how they're using GPTs to generate content for themselves. And although I really firmly believe that the intellectual exercise of putting a paper into my brain and thinking about it and churning through it, coalescing some thoughts and then getting them shaped up into a point where I can look into my camera and share them with you, the final product of the podcast or the LinkedIn post by that point is kind of beside the point. The real value for me is the intellectual activity of chewing through the paper and trying to decide, what do I think about this? How does this mesh with my experience? So my goal was not to create a content generation engine, but my goal was to create a fairly smart archive where I could go back and say, hey, I'm pretty sure that I covered this one thing in a previous podcast episode. Can you tell me which one it was? And I'll go back and review that. Or I know a couple weeks ago, I had a paper on LLM limitations in healthcare. Can we pull that back up? I wanted to look at that. I just spent the past probably 90 minutes creating a custom GPT. I did this with a personal subscription to ChatGPT. And it's been an interesting experience. So in the first place, the user interface is fairly straightforward to customize. It's very easy to upload documents and to give it a little bit of text. So for example, I was doing two things. So one, I was trying to create an archive of my past references and link them to individual podcasts. So I would upload a paper and I would say, hey, I covered this paper in episode 56. This paper is on digital pathology. Please associate this paper with episode 56. And I was also doing things like, grabbing a paper on clinical best practices in generative AI and saying, hey, this is a new take on clinical best practices in generative AI. I'm going to want to read this and reference it for a future podcast episode. And as I'm going along, I'm filling up my archive. I'm feeling really good about myself. I'm patting myself on the back for all the content I've generated, all the papers I've read, and all the knowledge that I've shoved into my own human brain. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll test it. So I asked it, hey, by the way, what two papers did I reference in episode 32? And it gave me a list of papers that I had uploaded, but they were not the papers that I had referenced in episode 32. And I know that because I had just listened to episode 32. I had just looked at my show notes for episode 32, just downloaded those papers and uploaded them saying, hey, these are the ones that I did in episode 30. So I said, okay, let's do some training here. And at this point, I was really starting to think about, it helps to anthropomorphize things, right? So I'm thinking about this custom GPT as my sweet brand new intern who doesn't know anything at all, but is very, very eager to please. So this person's got a lot of theoretical skills and they don't know how to work for me at all. So it's my job to teach them how to be a good intern for me. I said, okay, here's the thing. I told you these papers were associated with this particular episode. Can you please, when I ask you, give me only these papers? Not what you think I might have talked about, not the overarching themes of the podcast, right? Don't tell me about trust and ethics in AI. Don't tell me about healthcare use cases for AI. Tell me about which papers I specifically covered in this episode, and you'll know that because I told you. That's the only way you'll know that. And it, it gives this chirpy little AI thing and talks about, okay, great, I'll do that going forward. So I prompted it again after I put my updates through and let it churn through. And boy, once again, it gave me one correct paper and then 6 wishful thinking papers. So I spent probably 15 or 20 minutes revising and prompting and reprompting until I got this right, which is great. Now I've got episode 32 nailed. The problem is, out of the 90 minutes that I spent setting this up, I spent probably 20 minutes teaching it about episode 32. So now it thinks that episode 32 is the most important episode, and any other specific questions I ask it, it automatically goes back to what I told it about episode 32. Because ChatGPT is like any other, large language model, right? It is not actually thinking. It is not creating a holistic mechanism in which it knows that I have a podcast that covers specific topics. In that podcast, I have episode. Each of those has a distinct subspecialty of information that I am covering, all of which are aligned with the overall themes of the podcast. It doesn't know that. It is based on predicting what word comes after the next one. That's what the T is. Right? That's transformer, right? That's the transformational bit of technology that makes GPTs so fluid, right? It's very good at aping language. It is not good at extracting meaning from that language and creating a deeper knowledge base. So I found this really illustrative, right? There's no cure for AI hype, like trying to actually make the AI do what you want it to do. And I thought that this was a fairly simple task. So I'm thinking about, okay, so how do I start to think about this in a healthcare setting, right? What if I wanted to do document management for healthcare? What if I wanted it to do document management for like a patient record? What if I wanted to be able to upload a series of radiology images or a bunch of something else and say, hey, please reference each of these for individual encounters. Please say, and then we can track these in time. But you're going to get the same sort of thing where you're going to get bias based on which one of these that you interact with most if you're not very careful about presetting and preconditioning your AI to expect a certain amount of structure. That's not what I did. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to do some more playing, but I thought that this was really A, fun, and B, might be of interest to others as you're experimenting with ways to incorporate artificial intelligence in your own regular workflow. Love a good reference manager. I think that with enough time and training, this one will become very powerful for me. I'm still not going to want it to generate content, but I do think it will be helpful to have a way to reference, hey, who did I speak to on this particular podcast episode? Or I think I talked to the author of that paper. Can you tell me who that is? Because brains are a terrible place to hold information. My analog memory backup is a good place to hold information, but not always the most reliable. And it is, of course, limited. So I would really love to have a digital archive where I could store this information and query it at will, but it has to be reliable. If this is something that's of interest with you, I'd be delighted to talk about it more with you. I'd be delighted to show you what it is that I did and go through some of the prompts that I used as well. If you have tips, if you've done something like this, please share them because I really do need them. My intern so far is very hot on one particular episode, really good at returning papers that I said I wanted to talk about in the future, and not great on the overall structure of, hey, what is it that I'm trying to create here? Which is on me, right? I'm the boss. I didn't tell him that.